Life has this funny way of blindsiding you when you're least prepared. That's exactly what happened to me on what started as a perfectly ordinary Wednesday night. I'd just gotten home from work, my heels clacking against the hardwood floor as I stepped inside. The day had been exhausting, and all I wanted was to sink into a hot bath and let the stress wash away. But little did I know, that evening would leave a permanent scar on my life, one that would turn everything in our household upside down. By the way, make sure to subscribe to my channel so I can keep sharing these wild, true stories with you. Stick around till the end, hit that like button, and show some love. This one's a doozy. The house was quiet when I walked in, which wasn't unusual. My husband, Ethan, had mentioned earlier that he'd be stuck in a late meeting. He'd been pulling long hours lately, trying to meet some big project deadline. That left only Mason, Ethan's son from his first marriage, at home. Mason was 20, a quiet kid who mostly kept to himself. He worked part-time at the local hardware store and spent most of his free time holed up in his room. We weren't exactly close, but we got along well enough. Over the years, I'd come to see him as someone who valued his privacy, just like his dad. The quiet when it was just the two of us had become normal. I dropped my bag on the kitchen counter and poured myself a glass of water. That's when I noticed Mason's truck was still in the driveway. Weird, I thought. He usually worked the evening shift. I called out his name, my voice bouncing off the walls. No answer. I figured he was probably in his room with his headphones on or maybe napping, so I didn't think much of it. After finishing my water, I headed upstairs to change into something more comfortable. The day had left me desperate for some relaxation. As I passed the bathroom, I heard the faint sound of running water and noticed the door was slightly ajar. That's odd, I thought. Mason was usually super careful about privacy. He always shut doors firmly, especially the bathroom door. My curiosity got the better of me, and I hesitated for a second before pushing the door open just a little more. What I saw stopped me dead in my tracks. Mason was standing by the sink, his back to me, shoulders hunched like he was focused on something. His movements were jerky, almost frantic, and I realized he was shirtless, his jeans hanging low on his hips. In his hands, he was clutching a washcloth, scrubbing at something I couldn't see. The creak of the door made him spin around, his eyes wide with panic. "Oh my God, I didn't hear you come in," he stammered, his voice shaky. I froze, just as startled as he was. My eyes darted between him and the washcloth, and a wave of awkwardness hit me like a truck. This wasn't exactly the scene I'd expected to walk into, and I immediately felt guilty for barging in. "I'm so sorry," I blurted out, looking away. I didn't mean to intrude. My heart was racing as I reached for the doorknob, ready to back out and give him the privacy he clearly wanted. But before I could close the door, Mason stopped me. "Wait," he said, his voice pleading. "It's not what you think." I hesitated, my hand still on the knob. Part of me wanted to bolt down the hallway and pretend this never happened, but another part was curious. His tone wasn't defensive, it was almost desperate, like he needed me to understand something. Against my better judgment, I turned back to face him, keeping my eyes locked on his face. "Okay," I said cautiously, trying to keep my voice calm. "What's going on?" Mason looked down, his face turning bright red. He seemed to be struggling to find the right words, his hands fidgeting with the washcloth. Finally, he let out a deep sigh and said, "It's just, I didn't know who else to ask." "Ask about what?" I pressed gently, my curiosity growing despite the awkwardness. He shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. "It's personal," he admitted. "I've been dealing with some stuff, and I don't know what to do. Dad's not here, and you're the only other person I can talk to." His vulnerability caught me off guard. Mason had always been so independent, never one to open up about anything personal. The fact that he was turning to me for help made me pause. I stepped into the bathroom, closing the door slightly behind me to give us some privacy. "All right," I said, keeping my tone neutral. "Why don't you tell me what's going on?" Mason hesitated, then started to explain. He was vague at first, stumbling over his words as he tried to describe the discomfort he'd been feeling. I listened patiently, piecing together what he was trying to say. It became clear pretty quickly that this was a sensitive issue, something he was too embarrassed to bring up with his dad. As he talked, I couldn't help but feel a pang of empathy. It's never easy to ask for help, especially about something so personal. I could see the struggle in his eyes, the battle between wanting to get help and being terrified of judgment. "Okay," I said after a moment. "First of all, it's good that you're paying attention to these things. It shows you care about your health. Second, there's no shame in asking questions or seeking advice." Mason looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mix of gratitude and relief. Really? You don't think it's weird? Not at all, I said firmly. I reassured him that everyone has questions about their body at some point. It's completely normal. For the next few minutes, I did my best to offer him advice, drawing from my own knowledge and experiences. I kept the conversation as practical and straightforward as I could, careful not to say anything that might make him feel even more awkward. It was clear that talking about this was a huge relief for him, even if the whole situation had started off painfully uncomfortable. As we talked, the initial tension began to fade. Mason started to relax, and I could tell he was grateful to have someone to confide in. By the time we wrapped up, he looked calmer, even managing a small, hesitant smile. Thanks, he said softly, almost under his breath. I didn't think I could talk to anyone about this. I smiled back, relieved that the awkwardness had passed. You're welcome, Mason. And remember, it's always okay to ask for help. No one has all the answers. When I left the bathroom, I was hit with a weird mix of emotions. On one hand, I was glad I could be there for Mason when he needed someone. On the other hand, the whole thing had been so unexpected and out of the ordinary that I wasn't sure how to process it. Something about that conversation felt important, like it had shifted something between us. I just couldn't figure out what it meant or how it would play out in the days ahead. I tried to shake off the strange feeling as I went about the rest of my evening, but it lingered in the back of my mind like a shadow. The house was quiet, the only sound the low hum of the air conditioner. Ethan came home late that night, tired but in a good mood, completely unaware of the unusual conversation that had happened while he was gone. As I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't stop replaying the evening in my head. Something had changed, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. All I knew was that life in our house would never feel the same again. The days that followed were strange, to say the least. On the surface, nothing dramatic happened. Ethan kept working his usual long hours, Mason stuck to his routine of part-time shifts and studying, and I juggled my responsibilities at home and work like always. But underneath it all, there was this unspoken tension between Mason and me. It wasn't just that we were more aware of each other's vulnerabilities now. It was something deeper, a shift in our dynamic that I didn't know how to handle. Mason had always been a bit of a mystery to me. He kept to himself, and our conversations, while polite, never went beyond small talk. But after that night in the bathroom, I felt like I understood him a little better. It was uncomfortable, but also kind of comforting in a way. I found myself thinking about him more than I probably should, not in a motherly or even a concerned way, but with a sense of curiosity. How had I never seen this side of him before? I realized there was more to Mason than just a quiet kid who stayed in his room all the time. He had this whole emotional depth that I hadn't even begun to understand. It was a Friday evening when I started to notice a bigger change in Mason's behavior. Ethan had gone out to meet a client, and I was in the kitchen prepping dinner. Mason hadn't come home from his shift at the hardware store yet. I was chopping vegetables when I heard his truck pull into the driveway. I paused, my knife hovering in midair, wondering how I should greet him. The awkwardness that had settled between us over the past few days had built this wall, and I wasn't sure how to break it down. When the front door opened, I called out, "Hey, Mason," trying to sound casual. He didn't answer right away, but I heard his footsteps as he walked into the kitchen. He looked tired but gave me a faint smile. "Hey," he said quietly. "What's for dinner?" I smiled back, relieved that he wasn't acting as distant as he had been lately. "Just some pizza. You hungry?" "Yeah, I'm starving," he said, grabbing a glass of water from the counter. We ate together in silence at first, the only sound the clink of forks against plates. But I noticed Mason seemed more at ease than he had in days. His smile was a little more genuine, and his body language wasn't as stiff. After a while, he set his fork down and looked at me, his cheeks tinged with pink. "I've been thinking about what you said the other night," he started, hesitating before continuing. I wanted to thank you again for listening." I looked up from my plate, meeting his eyes. The sincerity in his voice made my heart soften. I'd been waiting for this moment, unsure of how to respond but glad he felt comfortable enough to bring it up. "Of course, Mason," I said gently. "I'm glad I could help." There was a long pause, but this time it didn't feel awkward. It felt like we were actually talking, not just filling the silence with polite chit-chat. "You've always been nice to me," he added, his voice quieter now. "I didn't want you to think I didn't appreciate it." I nodded, unsure of how to put into words how much that meant to me. "I know it's not always easy," I said after a moment, "but I'm glad you know you can talk to me anytime." He smiled again, this time with a little more ease. "I'll try to remember that," he said, reaching for another slice of pizza. As dinner went on, we slipped into more casual conversation. We talked about his classes, how his job was going, and the new show we were both binge-watching on Netflix. It was a small step forward, but a step nonetheless. I realized that, even though things had been awkward after our initial conversation, Mason was starting to open up in small ways. Later that evening, after we finished eating, I settled on the couch with a book to unwind. I heard Mason head to his room, his footsteps soft on the floor. I couldn't help but wonder if he was still processing everything we'd talked about. The next few days were more of the same. Ethan came home later each night, his work demanding more and more of his time. Mason, while less distant than before, still kept to himself in a lot of ways. We had brief but meaningful conversations during dinner, and he seemed more comfortable around me. But there was still this underlying tension that neither of us was ready to address. Then, about a week after our conversation in the bathroom, Mason did something that completely caught me off guard. It was late, almost bedtime, and I was curled up on the couch watching the latest episode of a drama. Suddenly, Mason appeared in the doorway, his expression hard to read. "Can I talk to you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. I sat up quickly, unsure of what to expect. "Of course," I said. "Come on in." He hesitated for a moment before stepping into the room. He seemed nervous, his posture stiff, like he wasn't sure how to say what was on his mind. "What's up?" I asked, trying to sound calm. I asked gently, trying to make him feel safe. Mason shifted his weight from one foot to the other, avoiding my gaze for a moment before finally speaking. "I've been thinking about the stuff I talked to you about," he said, his voice hesitant. "And I think I need to tell Dad. I don't know how, but he needs to know what I'm going through." His words caught me off guard. This was different from before. He wasn't just opening up to me anymore. He was taking responsibility for his feelings and acknowledging that he needed Ethan's help, not just mine. I smiled, trying to reassure him. "That's a big step, Mason. And I think Ethan will really appreciate you coming to him. It's not easy, but it's important." He nodded, his eyes meeting mine with an intensity that said more than words ever could. For a brief moment, I saw something flicker in his gaze. Gratitude, maybe, or something deeper. It hit me then just how far he'd come. Deciding to talk to Ethan wasn't something he'd done lightly, and yet there he was, standing in front of me, vulnerable in a way I hadn't seen before. It was like he'd crossed a line he'd been too afraid to approach until now. "I don't want to make things weird between us," he said quietly, his voice almost hesitant. "I know it's been different lately. I know things haven't been the same." His words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of everything that had shifted between us over the past few weeks. I shook my head immediately, a rush of warmth filling my chest. He was trying so hard, and that alone made me want to reassure him. "It's not weird at all, Mason," I said firmly, stepping a little closer. "Nothing's weird between us. We're family, you know. And families, real families, help each other, no matter what." I hoped the sincerity in my voice would reach him where he needed it most. He met my gaze again, and I saw a small but genuine smile tug at the corners of his lips. It was brief, but it was there, proof that my words had landed. With a subtle nod, he turned to leave, but not before offering one last bit of gratitude that made my heart swell. "Thanks for everything," he said over his shoulder, his voice slightly muffled as he headed for the door. I stood there, letting his words sink in, and then let out a breath I didn't even realize I'd been holding. A deep sense of pride washed over me, not just for the progress he'd made, but for the person he was becoming. This wasn't the same Mason I'd known before, the one who used to avoid conflict or hide his emotions. He was learning to communicate, to face the discomfort of asking for help, and to work through his feelings in a healthier way. It was a process, but I could see it now. He was changing for the better. And in that moment, I realized I wasn't just helping him. I was witnessing a pivotal moment in his growth, one that would stay with him for the rest of his life. The next day, Ethan came home from work earlier than usual, something I noticed right away. He looked tired, his shoulders slightly hunched, but there was a lightness in his step, like he was carrying something that had lifted his mood. "Hey," he greeted, his voice warm but edged with exhaustion as he dropped his briefcase by the door. "How's everything going?" "Good," I replied, smiling softly, though I think Mason has something on his mind. Ethan's brow furrowed slightly, his curiosity piqued. He looked at me, his gaze lingering with a hint of concern. "What do you mean?" he asked, his tone betraying his interest. I leaned against the kitchen counter, choosing my words carefully. "He's been more open lately, more expressive. And he mentioned earlier that he wanted to talk to you about something important." I could see the way Ethan's eyes softened at the mention of Mason wanting to confide in him. There was something in the way he held himself, a quiet readiness for this moment. He paused, letting my words sink in, and his expression shifted subtly, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced by a mix of anticipation and concern. He understood that something was changing, something significant. "I'll talk to him," he said, his voice steady and resolute. "Thanks for letting me know." Later that evening, after dinner, the house grew quiet. Mason and Ethan settled down together in the living room. I wasn't close enough to overhear their conversation, but I could see their body language. Mason leaned in, speaking earnestly, his hands gesturing as he explained something important. Ethan, ever the attentive listener, nodded slowly, his face soft with understanding but also tinged with concern. There was a warmth in his expression, a father's protective love and a willingness to hear whatever his son needed to say. I could tell this was a crucial moment, one of those defining conversations that marks a turning point in a relationship. For Mason, this was more than just another talk. It was the moment he began to truly step into adulthood. And for Ethan, it was the moment he realized his son wasn't a kid anymore. The man Mason was becoming was someone he'd need to understand and support. In that room, there was an unspoken understanding that their relationship was evolving, but it was also clear that both of them were ready to embrace the change. It was a pivotal moment, one that showed the strength of their bond, now tested by the complexities of growing up. As the weeks passed, a sense of normalcy began to settle back into our lives, and with it came a subtle but undeniable shift in the atmosphere. The heavy, unspoken tension between Mason and me gradually melted away, easing with time. He no longer seemed to retreat into his own world when I was around, and though it was clear he was still processing everything he'd opened up about, there was a noticeable lightness in him, a return to himself. It was like the weight he'd been carrying had eased, even if just a little, and I couldn't help but feel relieved. Ethan and Mason started spending more time together, and their relationship grew stronger. Ethan was making a real effort to be more present for his son, and I could see it in the way Mason's smile became more genuine and the laughter between them more frequent. There was an unspoken effort to rebuild, and it was heartening to watch. One weekend, Ethan suggested we take a day trip to the lake. "It'll be good for us," he said. "A chance to bring the three of us closer and make some new, happy memories." I thought it was a great idea, a way to reset and enjoy the simple joy of being in nature. The weather that day was perfect, like the universe had decided to give us a fresh start. The sky was a brilliant, uninterrupted blue, and a soft breeze rustled the leaves in the trees, making everything feel peaceful and calm. We packed a picnic basket with sandwiches, fruit, and snacks, loaded everything into the car, and headed toward the lake, looking forward to a day free from the usual distractions. When we arrived, we threw ourselves into the simple joys of the day, swimming in the cool, clear water, tossing a frisbee back and forth, and soaking up the sun on the soft sand. Mason seemed genuinely happy, more relaxed than I'd seen him in a long time. The laughter between him and Ethan as they played with the frisbee was like music to my ears, and the way they teased each other in good fun filled me with something I hadn't felt in a while: hope. Their bond was deepening, and I couldn't help but feel incredibly grateful for this time together. It felt like a turning point, not just for them, but for all three of us. As the day began to wind down and the sun dipped toward the horizon, painting the water in golden hues, we settled on the beach, soaking in the last warmth of the day. Ethan, worn out from the activities and the sun, had dozed off on a blanket, his soft snores blending with the rhythmic sound of the waves. Mason and I sat a few feet apart, both lost in thought as we stared at the horizon. The quiet between us was comfortable, the kind that comes from shared understanding and unspoken connection. After what felt like forever, Mason broke the silence. "Thanks for coming today," he said, his voice quiet but sincere. "It's been nice, just spending time together." I turned to him, a soft smile forming on my face as a warm sense of peace washed over me. "I'm glad," I replied, my voice carrying the weight of my emotions. "We should do things like this more often, more than we think we need to." He nodded slowly, his eyes still fixed on the water, like he was turning the moment over in his mind. "Yeah," he said quietly. "I think it helps." We sat in that comfortable silence a little longer, the kind that doesn't need words to say what's already understood. It felt like we'd reached some unspoken agreement, one that didn't need to be said out loud. It was a shared sense of healing, of moving forward, that spoke volumes in the stillness. When Ethan stirred awake, stretching lazily on the blanket, we packed up our things and started the drive home. The car ride was filled with light-hearted laughter and stories about our day, the mood easy and carefree. I felt a warmth in my chest that hadn't been there before, a deep sense of belonging and connection. That night, as I lay in bed beside Ethan, my thoughts drifted to everything we'd been through over the past few weeks. There had been struggles, sure, challenges that tested us, but they'd also led to something far more important, a closeness, a resilience, and a deeper sense of family than I ever thought possible. Mason's journey wasn't over, but I wasn't afraid of what the future might hold anymore. I felt confident, truly confident, that he was on the right path. And maybe just as importantly, I felt like we were, too. Life has a way of throwing us into moments of discomfort and vulnerability, but it's through those moments that we grow and connect. Mason's story is a reminder of how important it is to open up to the people we trust, even when it's hard. Whether it's asking for help, sharing our feelings, or seeking support, these are the steps that lead to healing and stronger relationships. The lesson here is simple but powerful. It's never too late to make meaningful changes in how we communicate with each other. We can build deeper, more understanding connections, no matter how tough life gets. It's important to remember that we're all human, and reaching out for help isn't a sign of weakness, it's a sign of strength. As we go through life, we realize that the relationships built on trust and mutual respect are what truly matter. Don't be afraid to speak up, to reach out, and to share your heart with the people around you. Life is about the connections we make, and sometimes the hardest moments lead to the most rewarding growth. If this story resonated with you, please like, comment your thoughts, and share. And don't forget to subscribe for more inspiring content.